All right, so today we're going to talk about, still in the category of neurophysiology, but we're going to talk about motor systems and reflexes. So really what we're going to talk about is initiating a movement and how we process through actually both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, but motor control and motor activity, we think of that as being part of the peripheral nervous system, because that's ultimately what we're going to have an effect on. So peripheral nervous system, motor, that's the category, that's where we are right now, and then somatic, because we're talking about voluntary control of movement. So the motor system maintains posture and balance, moves limbs, trunk, head, eyes, facial expression, and speech. So it's not just about moving the arms and legs, but it's also about posture and balance, moving them efficiently and in a way so we don't just fall over. Also eye movements, that kind of thing. So voluntary movements consciously activated to achieve a goal, and then reflexes, we're going to go over those. So two neuron groups we talk about. So there are a lot of ways to divide things and categorize things, and in this case this is another one of those, but we kind of separate these into upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. Part of the reason we do that is because there are different diseases that will affect upper or lower motor neurons differently, but also just because it kind of helps us keep organized. If we're talking about upper motor neurons, we're talking about those in the cerebral cortex in the brain. So that includes, the cortex down to the basal ganglia structures. And then lower motor neurons, those are when it kind of exits the brain stem and moves into the spinal cord. All right, so this is just a picture of the neuromuscular junction. So this is just kind of a reminder, this is what we're talking about, and it's a nice picture. It kind of shows those acetylcholine, the vesicles filled with acetylcholine binding, and then binding receptors, acetylcholine receptors, and then being broken down by that acetylcholinesterase. And then the action potential will move into the cell and cause a contraction. So good time to review every time you see that. Frequency tension relationship. So when a muscle, when we send that action potential, so we saw that acetylcholine binding to the receptor, that's the action potential that happens in the muscle. So that's very rapid, okay? So, but the actual muscle contraction comes after that takes place, and that's what we call a twitch. So if we have a single action potential that moves down and causes a muscle contraction, this is the tension, okay? And we can see that this neuron, so the depolarization, repolarization has already happened and the muscle is still contracting. So we can kind of throw another one on there and we can say, okay, well, let's just have another contraction here, or another depolarization action potential here. And what that will do is it will add to this, okay? So it'll make the tension increase, okay? So that's kind of what this is all telling us. This may last, a twitch may last 1 to 2 milliseconds, but that mechanical response, that actual muscle contraction will last from that twitch, or from that action potential will last 100 milliseconds. Okay, still only a tenth of a second, so it's still fast, but it's it's a lot slower than the action potential lasts, which means that we can start adding action potentials. And that's really all it means. We can start adding action potentials, and as we do that, we're going to have more and more tension. Okay, so that's our point. So when that stimulus is applied before that fiber has relaxed, then you have contraction again, and then you have peak tension, and it can increase. So the increase in muscle tension from successive action potentials occurring during the phase of mechanical activity is known as summation. Okay, so we're summing them together, and the term used for that repeated activation, so that repeated stimulation, is known as tetanus, or tetanic contraction. Okay, so this is a visual, this is showing what we're talking about. So S1, these are the action potentials, so that's stimulus. So the first stimulus happens here, and then you can see that you have the tension from the muscle, and then it goes away. And then you have a second that happens here, and then it goes away. But if you compound these, if you do stimulus here, and then a little bit later another stimulus, then we kind of see the picture I was trying to draw on the other page where it kind of adds to it. And if you do them quickly enough, then you don't even see the dip. Okay, so they just kind of add on to each other. They're kind of fused together. So that's a fused tetanus. So you have that nice smooth muscle contraction. So you see the same thing. There's your twitch down on the bottom here, and then stimulus, stimulus, stimulus. And so even though you've got increase in muscle tension, it's not fused. It's an unfused tetanus, and it's only when it happens very, very rapidly that you get the fused tetanus. So remember, signals, so the brain doesn't do intensity so much when it comes to action potentials. That's why when we talk about the all or nothing principle of action potentials, that's why we talk about that, because it's not, action potentials can't be stronger or weaker. They are just there, all or nothing. But the frequency can change, and that's how we do intensity of senses, sensation intensity, and that's how we do muscle tension, activation of muscle. All right, so we're going to start talking about the different areas of the brain and the different things that they're going to do. And we're really going to kind of break it down into three things. There's a lot going on, and we'll see that, but really it kind of comes down to three different, I guess, activities that happen. So the brain influences activity of the spinal cord, so we're talking about voluntary movements, but these hierarchy controls. So if we put this in the simplest terms possible, our highest level of control is just saying we're going to move. So I'm going to pick up my cup. I'm going to, jump in the pool, whatever I happen to be doing. So that's our highest level of control. That's going to involve the frontal lobes and maybe the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe can kind of give you a sense of your surroundings and make sure that the area is clear. So kind of that stuff. Maybe it's subconscious, maybe it's conscious. And then our middle level is tactics. So that's going to be, how exactly are we going to do this? Let's say we're doing something complicated like picking up a cup. How do we do it? What muscle groups are going to be involved, and what kind of coordination is going to happen? That's our middle level. That's our tactics. And then the execution is that lowest level. And that's your primary motor cortex saying, all right, we have everything planned, here we go. And it sends the signal. So that's our execution. That's our lowest level. Now, high, medium, low, middle, low, that's kind of subjective, but those are the three things that happen. So I have sensory motor system here because we're constantly getting feedback of our position, muscle tension, that kind of thing. So we have a lot of sensation and our surroundings and what's going on. So all of that stuff is integrated to the sensory information. All right, so this is kind of a picture showing these areas, kind of defining what they are or where they are. So we have the primary motor cortex here. It's in front of the central sulcus. So it's pre-motor. it's in front of the central sulcus. I can't think of the term right now, but it's in front of that central sulcus as opposed to being behind it. So I remember that it's in front by the this is my memory trick, is I think move forward. We're moving forward, so movement is in front, and then behind that is the sensory. So S1 is the sensory area. So M1 is the primary motor area, and primary motor cortex. So then we have the pre-motor area. That's what PMA is. Pre-motor area, that's where kind of things are put together along with the supplemental motor area. So this is where the movement is kind of organized and planned out. So everything that's going to happen is kind of set up in that area, and then it is activated by the primary motor area. And then of course you've got your frontal cortex up here, and then there are some other regions we can't see that are also involved. So, but the frontal cortex, those areas, that's with your that's your planning. The idea of moving. So again, same thing. Prefrontal, motivation, foresight to plan, initiate movements, emotional behavior, mood, all of the factors that have to go into, are you motivated to move? Is this something you want to do? Kind of therapy, emotional behavior. And also, you know, the need for something. I want my coffee, or I'm thirsty, you know, that kind of thing. Premotor area, that's supplementary area or supplemental area. Anterior front of the primary motor cortex. So this is where motor information is organized, so your actual movement is first put together there. So that's what I was talking about. That premotor area is where you've decided you want to do it. Now it's saying, okay, this is how we're going to do this move. It's not conscious. You're not thinking about it, because you know that. I mean, if I get my coffee cup, I'm not thinking, okay, I'm going to open my hand, I'm going to close my hand. I'm not going through all of that. But that's what's happening continuously. It's being passed then to the primary motor cortex. Okay. And that's where the initiation, that's where it says, okay, go. And that's it. Okay. And that's where it activates those upper motor neurons, and then they send the signal down. Okay. So if we look at that primary motor cortex, we can see that we have different values, I guess. There's a different, there's more and less space taken up of that part of the brain. Okay, so in that sulcus here, or that gyrus. So we have the hand. You can see that a lot of motor activity, so this part of the brain is dedicated just to the hand, just to moving the hand. And then if we look at, you know, the whole trunk, hip, knee area, that's about the same amount. So we've dedicated a lot of brain to controlling the hands, and then also the mouth area. Okay, so this is all just mouth, tongue, so that's probably for speaking. So we can kind of almost say, well, what's most important? Well, probably talking, communication is important, and doing things with our hands is important. Other things, we don't have as much control over them, so we don't see that kind of brain dedication for our feet, because we don't handle things with our feet. They're just kind of walking, and same with, you know, the rest of our lower body area. The tongue has quite a bit here, because, you know, it's moving food around. It has to stay away from the teeth, so it's got a lot of coordination that it has to do kind of automatically. So yeah. So motor is over here, sensory is over here. So when we're talking about motor now, this is how your brain thinks you look. At least this part of your brain, the primary motor cortex, that's how it thinks you look, because that's what's important to it. All right, basal ganglia. So I talked about these supplemental areas, and that's what the basal ganglia is. It actually includes all of these areas. So that's how movement's coordinated. It's how it's timed. So planning, organizing, and coordinating it. Also posture. So those things are all these basal ganglia structures. So there are a lot of structures involved with the basal ganglia. And let's see, they're kind of listed here. So there are others down here. But the basal nuclei, the thalamus, cerebellum, cerebral cortex, all of these areas that you can kind of see with these arrows are checking in with each other, and they're all contributing to some kind of movement. We talk about the primary motor cortex because that's what's initiating, saying, okay, this muscle's moving, now this muscle's moving. But to get to that point, we have that coordination. And we also have, we'll see, extrapyramidal signals that are going directly to kind of keep that balance. So these feedback loops among the basal ganglia, so they can be stimulatory or inhibitory. So when we contract one muscle, like in our leg or our arm, if you bend your arm, then you're contracting your bicep, but you have to send a signal at the same time to inhibit the tricep, the antagonistic muscle on the other side. Okay. All right, so let's talk about these nerve tracts. So we've mentioned that we're going from the precentral gyrus, the motor cortex, down, okay, to these motor neurons out here. So that's the basic signal that's taking place. But I also mentioned that you have a lot of other stuff going on to kind of make sure that's taking place properly. So the signal, or the neurons that are kind of passing through the brainstem in this area, and we can see that that's the pyramid, so that's what we're calling the pyramidal system. And that is, let's see, so that's going to be you're controlling speed, precision of skilled movements, and also muscle tone. So this is really activating the muscle and giving it, you know, the strength that we need, the tension that we need, so the frequency of the transmission of the action potentials, and organizing and saying which muscles are going to be activated. But then we have the indirect pathways that have a lot of that feedback and a lot of that processing that moves through here. Lots of areas involved with that, but that doesn't go through the same pyramidal tracks that you can see here. It kind of goes, it's outside of that, and so that's what we call extrapyramidal. Okay. So the indirect pathways or extrapyramidal system is less precise movements, and that's going to be more about modifications and balance, and they have that control loop, that constant feedback with that sensory information to make sure the movements happen correctly. So again, if we look at all the regions that are involved with so many, I guess, moving parts is the way I put it here, but with so many regions involved and so much feedback and these loops that are created, then it's easy to see that if anything goes wrong with one of these structures, then you're not going to have proper movement. Okay, so that's going to compromise balance or initiation, something. Okay, so Huntington's disease, I show another graph on the next page that kind of gives more detail. Huntington's disease, Parkinson's disease, coordination dysfunction, ataxias, and dyskinesias, akinesia, basal ganglia, any kind of these disorders. I mean, that's kind of a group of these disorders. But if we look at, and here's the ALS, amyotrophic sclerosis, or Lou Gehrig's disease, or Stephen Hawking's disease, because that's what he had too. That's where we're talking about like the upper and lower motor neurons. So a lot of these are kind of in the central nervous system, but ALS can affect the muscles going to the motor neurons going to the respiratory system in the periphery as well, or the digestive areas, okay, which can be a problem, or the esophagus, and you can't swallow. It's awful. All right, so a few more pictures. Of course, you don't have to know all the details of these tracks, but these tracks have been kind of mapped out. So we do know, and they've been mapped out primarily because of disorders and diseases. We can see that something was damaged, and when something got damaged, these were the effects. And this was the downstream effect. We didn't have, let's see, for Parkinson's disease, degeneration of dopaminergic substantia nigra input. So we look at the substantia nigra and we say, okay, well that's going away. So here's in this picture, the substantia nigra is down here. So we're saying that's going away, and the result of that is that we don't have the input to this area like we need, okay, which is going to make initiating a movement difficult. So we see a lot of input here, but we also see that just damage to that one area can cause these effects with Parkinson's disease. Huntington's disease, similar. It affects, instead of dopaminergic, it initially affects GABA inhibitory neurons. So you have loss of inhibition of neurons in these areas, the striatum, the caudate putamen, globus pallidus, these areas, which are all part of the striatum. And then so you have hyperkinesia, so you're moving too much, you're flailing your arms around. It's a violent flinging movement on one side of the body. So this is the lack of inhibition. So just a mistake or a problem with these inhibitory neurons here, okay, because there's inhibition and there's kind of this backwards thing where the globus pallidus is kind of on all the time. I think that's the one. And then you have to shut it off for a movement, but this is kind of on. And so you're lacking some of that inhibition. Okay. All right, so there's my dog. So let's see, we're going to move on to reflexes. So we have this thing, I labeled this as who even needs a brain. So reflexes, kind of, we're talking about, in this case, spinal reflexes, because of course you need a brain. That was not serious, we do need a brain. But we also have reflexes that happen like in your brain stem. So we'll talk about those every now and then when we're talking about how to control things like blood pressure, and so that kind of feedback. But right now we're talking about spinal nerves. So a reflex is a basic functional unit of the nervous system and the simplest portion capable of receiving a stimulus and producing a response. So what we mean is that we're not getting a lot of brain involvement. All those loops we saw with the basal ganglia, those aren't around for a spinal reflex. And that's a problem because usually our reflexes are not that coordinated, but they're surprisingly coordinated for as simple as they are, and the fact that the spinal cord is kind of running the show. So automatic response to a stimulus, so if you hurt yourself, if you burn yourself, if you step on something, your body can very quickly and automatically respond to that. So action potential is produced in sensory receptors, so this is kind of how it happens. It is simple. So produced in sensory receptors are transmitted to sensory neuron and then to interneurons, and then from those interneurons back to motor neurons. So it's just a little tiny loop. And of course, during that, you have some division and some branching that lets the brain know what's going on, and the brain can override some of that, but that's slower. So the effector organ is the muscle or the gland which responds with a reflex, and we do include glands here because when we were talking about like there are, producing sweat or tears or something like that, a lot of times that's just automatic feedback. We already mentioned the bladder micturition. That's a reflex that happens in the bladder. It senses that the bladder is expanded, and so it sends a signal back saying, okay, we're going to activate the parasympathetic division, and we're going to cause contraction and release of urine. So that itself is a reflex. It's just not really considered a spinal reflex. Not in the somatic system, which we have control over anyway. All right, so spinal cord, this is kind of a review, or not a review, but this is just something I'm not going to test over because this is the anatomy, but you should be kind of aware of it. So we have cervical nerves, we have thoracic, lumbar, sacral. So the spinal nerves that come out in a certain region, and they innervate that certain region. We call that in sensory we call it a dermatome, but it innervates a certain portion of the body as it comes out of those between the cervical vertebrae, the bones. Okay, and then down here, so this is kind of an interesting point that I put in here. We have something called the cauda equina, which is I guess it translates to horse's tail, but that's where, so you can see in this area up here where it's pretty dense, the nerves, the neuronal tissue going up and down the spinal cord, pretty dense up in this area. But then when you get down here, it's not as dense, and they kind of run down to the sacrum and to the lower lumbar areas. And so whereas it's dense up on top, it's kind of lacy down here on the bottom, and that's kind of important for like giving an injection. So if you're giving an epidural, then if you miss, hopefully you're not going to miss, but if you enter the spinal cord in that area, or if you're getting cerebral spinal fluid like a spinal tap, then there's less chance of damage, okay, in that area. All right, fun. Okay, so just another view of the spinal cord, and these are the spinal nerves coming out. You have a couple of things to look at. You have a ventral root and a dorsal root. So that's important because the dorsal area is going to be sensory. That's the information coming in, afferent, and the ventral, the ventral root is going to be motor. So remember, ventral means front, dorsal means back. So again, motor is in the front, move forward. So motor information is going in, afferent. Let's see, the motor information is not going in, it's going out, efferent, and to control the muscles. Okay. So same thing, different view. Ventral root, dorsal root. This is the dorsal root ganglia. That's where all the cell bodies are for the nerves going in. Let's see, and then they kind of join up to form that spinal nerve. So this is the spinal nerve. These are the roots, but you know, it maintains that fidelity of what's sensory information going in and motor information coming out. All right. We see here the tracks going up and down, and we can see that they carry different information to different areas. So here we just have it broken down as these are sensory, and then the purple are muscle, so you can kind of see where these different areas are. And I have this note here, and it's something to remember and think about, but you know, not every spinal cord injury is just a complete severing of the spinal cord. Sometimes it's crushed, and there are different effects, different damage that can take place. So, you know, if you have a damage in this area but not these areas, then, you know, mapping that out and knowing what's going on in those areas is kind of important, because you'll have different symptoms and different potentials of recovery. All right, so let's talk about a spinal reflex arc, just the general concept of what we're saying, and hopefully this will already just make sense. We have sensory information involved here. So let's say that, you know, something lands on you, a spider. Actually, that would have a lot of visual reflex parts to it too. But you hit your thumb with a hammer. Okay, we'll just be real cliche about it. And so that sensory information goes in, and then it synapses with an inner neuron. Okay, so this is an inner neuron, which will then synapse with a motor neuron. See, and the whole point of this is the brain isn't involved in it. Synapses with a motor neuron, and it will cause an activation of your muscle, and your muscle will cause you to pull away. Okay, or maybe touching a stove might be a better, something hot, and will cause you to pull away. So that's really the simplest way to put this. There are, sorry, I took a drink of my coffee. So there are a lot of reflexes that exist in your body. So we already mentioned, like, the bladder control. That's a reflex. There are reflexes controlling your heart rate, and that kind of thing. But we're going to talk just about a few of them associated with muscle control. And they are going to be titled the stretch reflex, the Golgi tendon reflex, and the Flexor withdrawal reflex. So we're going to go through these, and we're going to define all these terms, and those are the things that you're going to have to know. Okay. All right, so we'll just do it. So muscle spindles. Muscle spindles are found in muscle cell. Okay, so there's a better picture of this on the next page, so I'm not sure why I'm drawing it, but if this is a muscle, then you're going to find these muscle spindles kind of spread out through the cell, or through the entire muscle. Okay, and they're innervated with, you know, slower innervation. But they're innervated so that when the muscle contracts, they also contract, and when the muscle relaxes, they also relax. Okay, so they have those gamma neurons instead of the fast, quick alpha neurons. So that's really the whole point of them. Is what they're doing overall is they're just seeing. So in addition to being innervated with muscle or with motor information to cause them to contract and relax along with the muscle, they also have sensory information, and that's what makes them unique, is that they are monitoring how contracted they are. Okay, so they're giving that feedback back, saying this is how contracted this muscle is. This is what allows us to know kind of the position that our muscle is in, because we know how contracted it is because of these guys, these muscle spindles. So they contract with the contractile muscles to maintain the same length, but they're innervated with slightly slower gamma motor neurons. That's what I was mentioning. When a muscle cell is stretched without a signal to stretch, such as may happen if the muscle is slightly pulled or a lot pulled. So we think of the knee reflex. When somebody hits your knee with the hammer, it kind of hits that tendon and it pulls the muscle, and the muscle is stretched, and it will cause the it'll cause your muscle to contract very quickly. Okay, so that's the reflex that we're talking about. So it signals the spinal cord to activate fast motor neurons to cause that contraction of the muscle. And the idea is that it's a protective mechanism to prevent the muscle from being overstretched. So if it's stretching, if the muscle is stretching in a way that you're not expecting, then the reflex would be to stop that from happening very quickly. All right, so muscle spindles are involved in these stretch reflexes, and we're going to see we can see the arc here of what's going on. So when the muscle suddenly stretches, it responds by contracting. So we see that sensory information here around the muscle spindle. So this is just the muscle, the surrounding tissue, is kind of the same thing as here on the left side. So we can, if we're looking over here on the right side, so we can see that sensory information. That sensory information goes to the spinal cord, and we see what the response is going to be. It's going to show activation of that muscle, okay? And it's going to contract. Now, this is showing synergistic muscles for balance and antagonistic muscles. So if I suddenly, so when you get that hammer, when you're testing those reflexes in your knee, then the muscle will contract. So the quadricep muscles will contract, but you have to relax those hamstring muscles on the other side. All right, so let's see. Yeah, so that's just kind of repeating the same stuff. All right, so this is our so this is our stretch reflex, another picture of the same thing. So we see that we hit the hammer here, which, that tendon kind of goes around the knee, pulls the muscle stretches unexpectedly, sends a signal to the spinal cord, which then sends a signal back to the muscle to tell it to contract. Okay. It also sends a signal up to the brain to let it know what's going on, and then the brain has, its own efferent signal to kind of respond to whatever it was that happened. Okay, so that's your stretch reflex. Okay, so the Golgi tendon reflex kind of has the opposite. It's doing something similar, but it kind of has the opposite response. Whereas the stretch reflex was causing the muscle to contract, the Golgi tendon reflex will cause the muscle to relax. Okay, so let's dig into why that's the case. So we have the Golgi tendon organ, which is what this guy is right here, and it exists on the tendon, and it will also measure tension in the tendon. Okay, so they have their ends in those bundles of collagen fibers located in that tendon near where the muscle begins. So when there's excess tension pulling on that tendon, okay, so this is just too much overall. It's not a very sudden type of thing. This is just, it can be sudden, but it's just how much tension is involved. And when there's too much tension in the tendon, it will send a signal. That's what the reflex is. The reflex is it's going to send that sensory information to the spinal cord, and then it's going to arc with an inhibitory interneuron. So now, whereas we had excitatory with the stretch reflex, now we have inhibition. Okay? So it's going to inhibit the muscle that had the Golgi tendon organ saying that it was too much. So if we look at a couple of practical, I guess, applications of this, if you're lifting a weight or something becomes too heavy, then the reflex is to say, okay, we're going to pull that tendon away from the bone. If we do this, we're going to damage the muscle. We're going to tear the muscle. We're going to tear the tendon. We're going to pull the tendon away from the bone. So the best way to stop this is to just relax the muscle completely. Okay, so that's the reflex. The other use that that we've kind of already talked about is what happens with the that sensory information can also go to the brain. Okay, so it's constantly going to the brain. This is involved with a reflex. This is just kind of talking about what this Golgi tendon organ is doing there. So one is the reflex, but the other is that it kind of tells you how much tension is on something that you're carrying. So if you're carrying books, you can kind of tell how heavy they are just based on how much tension it's putting on that Golgi tendon organ. So that's the sensory information that allows you to see how much tension you have on a muscle and how much that weight is. Okay. All right. So yes. So remember that causes relaxation. That reflex does. So now we'll kind of talk about the withdrawal reflex, or what we call the flexor withdrawal reflex, and that's putting all of this together. So we have an instance here where someone has stepped on a thumbtack. That's sensory information. It moves up to the spinal cord. The spinal cord has an excitatory interneuron, and you have contraction. However, the problem with this simple reflex is that you are going to fall. Okay, you can't just contract a muscle and then just fall down, and that's not going to make anything any better. So we have something called a cross extensor reflex. So that flexor withdrawal reflex. So with the withdrawal reflex with that extensor reflex. So now we step on the tack and it sends that information, but instead of just giving that excitatory neuron here, let's see, it's not the excitatory, yeah, this is an excitatory neuron there, that then will activate this to pull away, will also send an inhibitory or an excitatory signal to the other leg to kind of pick up the slack. Okay, so the only thing missing here in this picture is the antagonistic. So if we're exciting this one, then we have to relax in this case we're contracting the hamstring muscles, so we need to relax those quadricep muscles, and that's going to be the opposite in the opposite leg. So this next slide kind of shows how this would actually be laid out, and we can see that we're kind of getting more and more complicated. So when all these are put together, we can begin to see how many of our motor movements are coordinated through the spinal cord. So we have the pain information coming in, and then we have activation of the flexor muscles and relaxation of the antagonistic muscles here. And then on the other side, or the ipsilateral is the same side, contralateral is the other side. I may have said that wrong once. But on the contralateral, on the other side, then we have the opposite. All right, so we have activation of those extensor muscles, and then the flexor muscles are relaxed. Okay, so when we think about that, there are a whole lot of reflexes that can happen. So there's a whole loop that can take place in the spinal cord just for like walking activities. Now that's going to have a lot of feedback with the cerebellum and the balance, so your vestibular system. But in general, we have a lot. We can get very, very complicated in all of these connections that happen in the spinal cord for these reflexes. So, but these are the three we're mainly going to just discuss for this class. And it looks like that is the last slide. This is kind of a short video. Have a good day.